Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Jim Petrosky. I'm the president of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. If you were expecting to see Peter Huessy, you'll get to see him in a little bit, along with our special guest. But I wanted to do a quick introduction to our inaugural event here, which is Huessy Events, a bi-weekly seminar series that Peter Huessy's established within NIDS. We're very happy to have Peter with us with his impactful information and his insights and his many connections to people that know the deterrence and national security area well. Just to give you a very quick introduction into NIDS, we opened our Huessy Events under our NIDS Events division of NIDS as an organization, which is a think tank, which is, by the way, oriented specifically on our national deterrence, but deterrence nationally as well as internationally. We've opened a few things I just want to highlight for you because I think they're important, because our interest is to make people aware of the value of deterrence and how it keeps peace and security and prosperity throughout the entire world, and certainly for our nation, preserving our freedoms and our values. And so we've opened NIDS Events, which Peter Huessy's Events is under this seminar. We've opened a impactful online journal called Global Security Review. If you haven't seen it, we try to publish at least every other day on impactful articles that may be even oriented on your organization. We've also opened NIDS Education, which includes an academy where people can take courses to prepare their workforce, prepare themselves, as well as interacting with outreach to universities to begin preparing undergraduate and graduate students for national security work. And so we've developed all of that, and then we have NIDS research centers. We're about ready to launch a space center, and then cyber center, as well as a nuclear center within our organization to do research related to that people can get involved in. And then lastly, we have podcasting, which is different than this seminar series, in that the seminar series, we want to have interaction with you and our guests and get insightful feedback, but as well as let you be a part of this. So hopefully every Friday or every other Friday, you'll be looking forward to getting into the seminar, and you won't be hearing me speaking every week. So with that information there, by all means, come to our website at thinkdeterrence.com if you want to learn more, or contact me at nids@thinkdeterrence.com, and I can help you navigate the many things that we're doing here at NIDS. But the most important thing for today is our Huessy Events, led by Peter Huessy, and I'm going to introduce him now. So Peter, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jim, and I want to thank everybody who's attending, particularly to our honored guests, Gordon Chang and Rick Fisher. As many of you know, I started this seminar series back in 1983 at the Capitol Hill Club, primarily to elucidate and illustrate the Scowcroft Commission report, which formed the basis of the congressional approval of the Reagan modernization program, which led subsequently to the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Empire. Unfortunately, I think we're back into a new Cold War of various types, but Gordon Chang is our first speaker. Gordon is a journalist. He's a lawyer and a writer. He also co-hosts with John Batchelor the CBS radio program Eye on the World, which I am honored to come and speak to occasionally. And he also wrote a book about the coming collapse of China, which I think is spot on, because I think he just figured it was going to collapse a little sooner than maybe it is. Rick Fisher is with the International Study and Assessment Center. If you want to know what China is doing with respect to nuclear weapons, you call Rick Fisher. And so Gordon's going to start off. He's going to talk about what are the implications of what China is going to do with the new nuclear weapons that they are projected to deploy, upwards of around 1,500 by 2035. And then Rick will talk about the actual beans in terms of the nuclear systems that they're building, when they're building them, the extent of them. And the thing is, given the lack of transparency in China, Rick is going to give us a range of what could possibly we could be facing, because the implications are very serious. With that, Gordon, I want to thank you on behalf of NIDS and my president here, Jim Petrosky, and Adam Lothar, who is our vice president. I want to thank you for being here, and it's over to you, Gordon.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Jim. Peter has asked me to cover two broad topics. One of them is China's strategic nuclear intentions, and the second one is North Korea's. And I don't want to hold you in suspense, so this is what I'm going to talk about. Herman Kahn told us that we must think about the unthinkable. And at this point, we actually need to start planning about it too. On the first topic, China, Peter has pointed me to an article from Foreign Affairs in November by 3 academics, including M. Taylor Fravel. And this article is a very cleverly worded apology for China's nuclear intentions. In general, what we have seen in the American Academy is they've migrated from the position that China is a benign nuclear power that only wants a small second strike capability to the new position, which is, yes, China is rapidly building up its arsenal, but it's America's fault. Really what we have gotten to is the blame America first position across broad portions of American academia. And I'd like to start not with Fravel, but with Fravel's star pupil, Fiona Cunningham of the University of Pennsylvania. And I want to do that because I think she illustrates much of what is wrong about today's debate about nuclear weapons and China. She wrote an article on the Arms Control Association's website in June, and it is titled China, The Unknowns About China's Nuclear Modernization Program. And in that article, she writes that policymakers and scholars outside China do not know why China is rapidly modernizing its nuclear arsenal. She doesn't know? Well, it's important here to say that she probably fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the Communist Party. And yes, I guess you could say Fiona is right in that the sense that China has become more opaque under Xi Jinping, especially in recent years. So we have less visibility inside the regime. But that doesn't mean we have the right to reject the notion of common sense. And it also means that we have to acknowledge those facts that we do know. So to understand why this regime is building up its arsenal, we need some context about the Communist Party and its ambitions. So let's start with perhaps the most important point today. And that is Xi Jinping is the most ambitious aggressor in history. We know this from what he's been saying about China's intentions. China, according to Xi Jinping, intends to annex the world and the near parts of the solar system. And yeah, I know that sounds a little bit exaggerated, but no, it's not. Xi Jinping has been working to impose China's imperial era system, where Chinese emperors believed that they not only had the mandate of heaven to rule what they called Tianxia, or all under heaven, but they believed that heaven actually compelled them to rule the entire world. But it really gets worse than that, because since 2017, Xi Jinping's officials have been talking about the moon and Mars as sovereign Chinese territory. I mean, that's right, part of the People's Republic of China. And that means they consider those near heavenly bodies to be like the South China Sea, theirs and theirs alone. And that means that they will exclude us from going to those bodies if they get the opportunity to do that. So the trend of Xi's recent comments tells us that his ambitions are unlimited. And to achieve them, of course, he needs a very effective and large arsenal of the world's most destructive weapons. So let me put it another way. China's militant regime believes it has the right to rule the world, and it needs nukes to do that. And you've got to remember that Xi Jinping's primary form of diplomacy is to intimidate opponents. So for instance, in July and September of 2021, the Chinese made threats to incinerate Tokyo, and Tokyo for supporting Taiwan, as well as Canberra, And that is because Australia was then joining the AUKUS Pact, which is the trilateral agreement among Australia, UK, and the United States. In March 2022, China's Ministry of Defense threatened, quote unquote, worst consequences for any country coming to Taiwan's assistance. And throughout this century, China has been making out of the blue threats to incinerate American cities. These threats became especially ominous in October 2013, when the main platforms of China's party and state media ran articles. These were articles in People's Daily, the most authoritative publication in China, China Central Television, and PLA Daily. And these articles, which were identical, talked about how Chinese submarines launching ballistic missiles tipped with nuclear weapons could kill Americans by the hundreds of millions. Now, the Chinese were kind enough to tell us which 11 cities they were going to obliterate: Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Portland and Maine, and the Navy towns of Annapolis and Norfolk. So you think you're going to move to Chicago? No. Chinese media said that wind-borne radiation would kill the population of that windy city. Now, why do we speak of these warnings, which are, after all, more than a decade old? Well, these warnings, they didn't come from rogue journalists. They had to come from the top of the Chinese political system, the Politburo Standing Committee. And this was within a year of Xi Jinping taking power. In other words, Xi Jinping announcing to the world and to the United States what he intended to do. Yeah, there are mere words, but mere words about the world's most destructive weapons have consequences. So just ask Vladimir Putin, who is now obviously Xi Jinping's ally in mischief. Putin has a doctrine that Peter has talked about. It's escalate to de-escalate, or escalate to win. In other words, threatening to use and maybe even using nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict to end it early. In June of last year, we had Putin, after making numerous threats to incinerate Ukraine and the rest of the world, he transferred tactical nukes to Belarus. Immediately after that, President Biden said Putin's threats to use nuclear weapons were real. And I actually think that Biden was telling the truth about that. Now, Putin saw, and this is the reason why these threats are important, Putin saw how the United States reacted to China's threats to use nukes. So then he decided that he would threaten nukes in the Ukraine. China then saw how the United States did not rush to Kiev's help in the way that it should. China saw that we were intimidated. And so what we have is both China and Russia, and as well North Korea, emboldened by the mere use of words, which means that both China and Russia have already used their nuclear arsenals to great effect without lighting one off. Now, let's get back to our friend Fiona Cunningham. Yeah. All that I've just talked about is open source. I have never had a security clearance. I don't have one now. I don't have a PhD. I don't even have a master's. All of this is well known. The question is, why doesn't she know about this? Remember, we've got Rick Fisher coming up, the world's greatest expert on the Chinese nuclear arsenal. And he will dispute these numbers, but let me just put them out because it illustrates a point anyway. The Pentagon, in a November 22 report, predicted that China would increase its arsenal from about 400 warheads then to 1,500 by 2035. Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall, in the following March, said obviously China was comfortable for a long time with a small arsenal, but it was no longer so comfortable. So the question is, what was China going for? Because it clearly wanted more than just a deterrent. 400 nukes are a deterrent. 1500 starts to look like a war fighting capability. Now, as Kendall testified, he had never seen anything so disturbing in his career as the forecast buildup of China's arsenal. And as Admiral Charles Richards said when he was the head of Stratcom, this was China's, quote, strategic breakout. And we should remember that China has become especially bold recently. And for this, we have to go back to January and February of last year, when Beijing floated that rather large object over our country and Canada. Now, its path over the lower 48 states was not random, especially we know that because it was doing figure eights over sensitive nuclear sites. That balloon flew over Maelstrom, Minot, and F.E. Warren, the 3 Air Force bases where we have all of our intercontinental ballistic missiles, our Minuteman IIIs. It flew close by to Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, the home to all the B-2s, and it floated near Omaha. That, of course, is Offutt Air Force Base, the home of U.S. Strategic Command. So we also have to be concerned, especially because there are indications that Beijing, with this balloon flight, was trying to figure out whether it could disrupt command and control signals. And this and other indications tell us that China is looking, at least thinking about, a first strike on the United States. One more thing when we talk about Chinese intentions. We all remember that infamous 1999 book by then 2 Chinese Air Force colonels, Unrestricted Warfare. Now that is, although Beijing denies it, that is Beijing's doctrine against the United States, that it can use any tactic against us. So would China be bold enough to kill Americans? Well, we already know they did that with COVID-19 and with fentanyl. So let's not be surprised. People's Daily, the most authoritative publication in China, as I mentioned, in May 2019 declared a people's war on us. And although we may think, oh, that's just mere propaganda, that phrase, people's war, throughout the communist period has had great resonance for China's leadership. So the summary is, unrestricted? Yeah, that really means unrestricted. So if China's regime is willing to kill Americans with COVID-19, which it deliberately released beyond its borders, we don't know how it started, but once it started, they pushed it out beyond its borders. So if they're willing to kill us with COVID-19 and fentanyl, then obviously they're malicious enough to kill us with nuclear weapons. Many people will say, well, look, they're not going to do, they would be willing to do the insidious stuff, but they won't do the obvious stuff. And of course, every warhead on the top of a missile carries with it a return address. Yes, but not every nuclear weapon is detonated after it has been put on top of a missile. We now got to be concerned that the Chinese or the North Koreans or somebody else could take a device, disassemble it, smuggle it through our open borders, and reassemble it in the city of their choice. So I think that Fiona Cunningham needs to get out of the arms control bubble and start to look at what the Chinese are actually saying and doing. And now let's talk about her teacher, Mr. Fravel. In his influential foreign affairs article, which was titled China's Misunderstood Nuclear Expansion, his thesis is this, and let me read it to you. Quote, China's nuclear expansion has clearly been driven by its growing sense of vulnerability and insecurity in the face of evolving US capabilities. In other words, we're pushing China to do something it really didn't want to do, at least according to the MIT scholar. He then talks about, and he's got a long quote about this, which talks essentially how China is reacting to the modernization of the American arsenal, about the change of our nuclear doctrine. And so therefore, that has pushed them into increasing the size of their arsenal. Now, Fravel is basically trying to argue this. Remember, since the end of the Cold War, the United States has reduced its deployed arsenal by 4/5. So Fravel is trying to say, look, as the US is drastically reducing its deployed arsenal, that's the reason why China is trying to quadruple its arsenal. This doesn't make sense. Or maybe I should be more precise. This doesn't make sense outside of US arms control community. Now, Fravel says there's also no evidence that China is increasing its arsenal to create a nuclear shield. In other words, to be able to threaten an opponent, to get an opponent to back down without fighting. But we have heard China's threats against the United States, against Japan, against Australia, against others. So obviously it wants to increase its nuclear arsenal in order to create the nuclear shield. On North Korea this month, two prominent US academics, Robert Carlin and Siegfried Hecker, write that North Korea has made a strategic decision to go to war. Now, as many people correctly say, the North Koreans could neither bark nor bite without Beijing say so. The North Koreans don't always listen to the Chinese, but when the Chinese want something from North Korea, when they demand it, they get it. Now, in the past, North Korea has been able to successfully play off Moscow against Beijing. I don't think they're going to be able to do that for very much longer because Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are now coordinating their policies. So if China does start a war in East Asia or stumble into one, we can expect them to demand that North Korea create a diversion and thereby by attacking South Korea or Japan or whatever. But the point is, we have to consider that the strategic intentions of North Korea are pretty much now the strategic intentions of China. China is now fighting proxy wars in Ukraine, North Africa, Middle East. It could certainly use another proxy war in South Korea on the Korean Peninsula if China actually does go to war. On war, let's remember the signs are unmistakable. Xi Jinping can't stop talking about it. So for instance, last March at the National People's Congress, he repeated his now favorite phrase, dare to fight. This message has been filtering down through the ranks because in the following month, the Eastern Theater Command of the People's Liberation Army, after completing provocative air and sea exercises around Taiwan, said it was, quote, ready to fight. But China is doing more than just talking. It is in the fastest military buildup since the Second World War. It's trying to sanction-proof its own regime. It is stockpiling grain and other commodities. And it is mobilizing China's civilians for war. And to add all this, there is now turmoil in the rocket force, the branch of the Chinese military that controls almost all of the country's nuclear weapons. Last summer, the top two officers, the commander and the political commissar, were disappeared. All in all, 70 in the rocket force have been relieved in the last 6 months. It's not just the rocket force. China's defense minister, the last one, he was last seen in public on August 29th. He was formally sacked on October 24th. He was not formally replaced until December 29th. These long periods of intervals, they suggest intense personal wrangling. We see Xi Jinping purging the military of officers who are opposed to war, most notably former Air Force General Liu Yaozhou, who thought invading Taiwan was not a particularly good idea. We have seen a number of Americans, including General Mike Minahan, talk about China's timetable to go to war. Minahan says that he believes it'll be next year. The turmoil in the rocket force, which has been revealed since Minahan's memo was leaked last January 27th, indicates, well, maybe the timetable has been put back, but maybe it's been accelerated. We just don't know. One final thought. We are at the most consequential and perhaps the most dangerous moment in history. Now, people will say, oh, that can't be true. It's got to be 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, or maybe even 1961, the Checkpoint Charlie crisis in Berlin. Yes, those two incidents looked extremely dangerous. But we now know from both the Soviet and the American archives that neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev were willing to use their nuclear weapons. We don't know that about either Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. And Rick Fisher, over to you, my friend. Everybody knows Dr. Fisher. He has done an extraordinary job of putting together the range of Chinese options, where they may be going over the next 10 or 15 years. Rick, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Peter, and also thank you for the honor of joining my good friend Gordon Chang for the inaugural session of the Huessy program at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. Yes, you should be seeing the first opening slide of my presentation, and what I'd like to do for the sake of time is to go directly to the last slide, if that's possible. Okay, there. I would just, to connect this presentation to Gordon's, would just emphasize that the Chinese goal, the goal of the Chinese Communist Party, is eventual global hegemony. And yes, as Gordon mentioned, it's not just hegemony over the Earth, but hegemony over the Earth-Moon system. The party needs to be able to control cislunar space between the Earth and the Moon in order to enforce its political, economic, and military hegemony on Earth. And in order to enforce that hegemony on Earth, yes, the Chinese Communist Party requires nuclear superiority. Nuclear superiority will give the party impunity. Impunity so that it can create bases all around the world, so that it can, as I suggest in my illustration on the left, proliferate a DF-41 class solid fuel mobile ICBM to North Korea. We really don't know what a Chinese DF-41 looks like. No image has been released, but a few years ago, CCTV released this cartoon. It looks very similar to the Chinese missile. And given the extent to which China is involved in the North Korean nuclear and missile program, I don't put it past them to have exported to North Korea the ability to make or assemble DF-41s. The tactical nuclear warhead that we see in the middle. Did that just emerge from the North Koreans? No, that had to come from the Chinese too, or their friends, the Pakistanis, or both. When China goes to the moon, it'll actually be bombing the moon. Its moon lander has a stage that will crash into the moon. So when we all trying to crowd into the southern part of the south pole of the moon, we have to contend with that. China wants nuclear superiority also to achieve coercion. Yes, the acme of Sun Tzu is to win without fighting. And in this connection, if we could then go back to the second slide. Yes, we have to consider the possibility that no matter what we think China's current or potential nuclear inventory may build up towards, there is the great possibility that China and Russia will engage in cooperative offensive nuclear cooperation. Hopefully just at the level of intimidation and not at the level of joint strike. Of course, our side can do a great deal to contain that cooperation, but the degree to which China and Russia have engaged in nuclear defensive cooperation over the last decade suggests to me that they have also carved out cooperation in offensive nuclear cooperation. Now, moving on to estimates for ICBMs. The next slide, please. By now, the PLA rocket force may be nearing completion of the 3 new silo fields in Western China. It only took the United States about 1.5 years to build the first Minuteman field at Malmstrom. The Chinese have been working on these fields now for almost 3 years, according to available commercial satellite imagery. Now, there's, I would say, something of a debate because I don't think it's really been answered over what kind of ICBM will be going into these fields. Yes, today, the standard China military power report out of the Pentagon, the consensus of the intelligence community, if you will, points to a version of the Dongfeng 31, which could have 1 to 3 warheads, and has moved toward discounting the possibility of the DF-41, which has the potential of 3 warheads identified, but also I don't think we really have the luxury to dismiss that it could be a 10 warhead capable ICBM. Just as recently as September 2021, former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Hyten, indicated that it could be a 10 warhead ICBM. And we've been reading from unofficial Chinese sources for many years that a follow-on to the DF-41 is in the works, called DF-45, DF-51 perhaps, but is always identified as a larger ICBM. And some estimates, open estimates of the size of the new silos indicates that perhaps greater than 4 meters. So it can take an ICBM far larger than the 2.4, 2.5 meter diameter DF-41. We also should consider that the buildup could come faster because the 2 main Chinese missile makers are now building solid fuel ICBM size rockets. China Aerospace Science and Technology, which makes the DF-41, and then China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation, which has its Kuaizhou series of solid fuel space launch vehicles. Kuaizhou 1 is very much a DF-31 size space launch vehicle, solid fuel, even mobile. And there is a larger Kuaizhou 11 that has been tested once, maybe twice. But China will also be introducing its fractional orbital bombardment system. Yes, the first may have been tested in 2021 on a Long March 2C space launch vehicle, but China is investing heavily in reusable space launch vehicles of the range of SpaceX, matching the range of SpaceX capabilities up to and including the SpaceX Starship, which could put 100 tons into low Earth orbit. Imagine how many FOBS boosters that could launch from the Wenchang Space Launch Center on Hainan Island. Next slide. And here I offer some potential estimates for the range of ICBMs and ICBM warheads. I'm essentially adding up the totals offered by an astute observer, Decker Eveleth, plus my own estimates for some categories, such as future FOBs. Today, there is a prominent estimate that China may have about 500 warheads. The intelligence community estimates this will grow to 1,000 perhaps by 2030, 1,500 by 2035. I would offer a 2035 estimate that's much larger. When we add in DF-45, 51, a rail-launched version of DF-41, which we know is at least in development, silo launch versions of DF-41, and giving this a range of 3 to 10 warheads. And so I come up with a spread of over 2,500 to over 5,500. That's just an estimate that I would consider realistic. Next slide, please. Moving on to the next leg of the Chinese triad, the undersea leg. There has been a major upgrade. Maybe it is ongoing, maybe it has already taken place, but this upgrade consists of replacing Julong 2 submarine launched ballistic missiles with longer range and MIRV capable JL-3 SLBMs. The JL-3 is sometimes said to be the equivalent of the Dongfeng 41. Chinese sources have mentioned 3 warheads, 6 up to 10 warheads, but a range of 10,000 kilometers means that the PLA can pursue a bastion strategy similar to that of the former Soviet Union, defending its areas of operation, very likely in the South China Sea, which explains why the Chinese Communist Party wants to control that body of water. I mean, literally control that body of water, and may fight a war in order to do so. Next slide, please. Here, I suggest a range of possibilities for the SSBN fleet and the warheads they carry. Currently, the warheads could range from over 250 to over 700. By 2035, if we consider at least 6 follow-on type 096 SSBNs and assume that it will be a larger a boomer with 16 SLBMs, as mentioned by Chinese sources occasionally, we get a much larger range of SLBM warheads by 2035, 1,200 to perhaps 1,800. Okay, next slide, please. The bomber force, the third leg of the triad, is also in the midst of a real growth phase. The H-6K, which first flew in 2007, may now have an order of battle up to 150. Recently, H-6Js from the PLA Navy Air Force have been combined with the PLA Air Force. The H-6K or Navy H-6J or the large ballistic missile carrying H-6N, all can also carry up to 6 land attack cruise missiles of the CJ-20 variety, 1,500 kilometer range, whereas air launched ballistic missile perhaps a 3,000 kilometer range. The H-6N is air refuelable, as we can expect the stealth flying wing Xi'an H-20. A decade ago, sources in Asia disclosed to me that it was expected that the H-20 would be entering service by 2025. That may perhaps be a bit late. I do expect that the American revelation of the B-21 could yet spur a near-term revelation, at least, of prototypes of the H-20. And People's Liberation Army Air Force has long been interested in boom-style refueling. Next slide, please. So with a fleet of just 150 H-6KJNs, if we assume 3 sorties, then this results in well, 900 LACMs potentially. And by 2035, I expect that H-20 production will kick in. H-6 production could probably be beyond 200, and the LACM sortie rate would grow accordingly. Next slide, please. And just briefly, so I don't take up too much time, I wanted to examine the issue of theater nuclear forces. Chinese barbarian handlers often tell Western scholars of the People's Liberation Army that it has no tactical nuclear weapons. Yes, they developed an airborne tactical nuclear bomb and tested it in the late 60s, but didn't do anything with it since then. My estimate is that this constant line of no tactical nuclear weapons could very well be a Chinese attempt at strategic disinformation. Who wouldn't in the PLA want to be able to reveal a very large tactical nuclear weapons capability to the United States on the eve of a Chinese-Russian campaign to attack and conquer Taiwan? Now, I would also note that the China military power reports also do not provide estimates for PLA theater nuclear forces. However, Russians have shed some light on this question. Back in 2016, former Russian chief of staff of their strategic rocket force, General Victor Yeltsin, told Sputnik, quote, according to available information, about 10 to 15% of DF-11s and 20 to 25% of DF-15s are equipped with nuclear warheads. Yeltsin probably has his own intelligence resources. When this estimate, I would suggest, is something that should be taken seriously. Now, the latest China military power report from last year tells us that PLA has 2,800 IRBM, medium-range ballistic missile, short-range ballistic missiles, and ground-launched cruise missiles. To that, I would add 150 H-6Ks times 6 land attack cruise missiles times 3 sorties, or about 2,700 land attack cruise missiles, potentially. So a potential for 5,500 theater missiles, all of which could be dual capable. So if we take Yeltsin's number, range of numbers, and average them, I come up with 17.5%. Just to be generous to the Chinese side. And that points to a potential 962 theater nuclear armed missiles. Now, I offer that, or we could believe the Chinese barbarian handlers. And with that, I will conclude my remarks so that we can get on to questions.
Thank you very much, Rick. There's a question from our president, from Dr. Petrosky. And I want to ask Gordon and Rick. The critics who think that the Chinese buildup is not going to be as great as it is, and as we don't have to worry, is that it's not aimed at the mainland United States. It might be aimed at attacking Taiwan or simply defending China. I'll start with you, Gordon. Should mainland USers be worried, or only Taiwan, or neither, or both?
Both is the answer. Yet fundamentally, the Communist Party views the United States as an existential threat. And they view us that way, not because of anything we say or do, Peter, but because of who we are. You have an insecure regime in Beijing is worried about the inspirational impact of America's values and form of governance on the Chinese people. So they believe that they will never be secure as long as the United States exists. You just take that simple fact. Excuse me. You take that simple fact, and of course their arsenal is aimed at us. They hope to hold us hostage. We'll go back to the nuclear shield argument of MIT's M. Taylor Fravel. Yes, of course they want it. I mean, that's the reason why they've been making serial threats against the United States to destroy American cities. So of course we have to be concerned.
Rick?
We have to take very seriously the possibility of an all-out nuclear strike. At a minimum, China wants us to believe that is possible in order to achieve coercive victories. Preventing the United States from coming to the assistance of Taiwan as the PLA invades and conquers that, destroys that democracy. Not only will that give the Chinese Communist Party a license to attack every other democracy, it will achieve the dismantling of the American-led military coalition in Asia, which will weaken our coalition in Europe and allow accumulating Chinese conventional, nuclear, and space forces to increasingly corner the United States, strategically limit our options, and then make us vulnerable to actual political coercion. I mean, we've already experienced China yelling at all of our companies to change how they describe Taiwan. I mean, just imagine what they'll be doing, what they'll be attacking, what they'll be constricting in our language and our laws once they have this overwhelming nuclear coercive capability.
Understood. My question to both Gordon and Rick is following. There have been analysis of the Chinese buildup, and they've said it is going to be very limited because China has a very limited ability to build fissile material or nuclear weapons fuel. And a number of people, including Mr. Jones, who works for Henry Sokolsky's organization, has written a number of papers showing that that's not necessarily true. Plus, we also have news that Russia is building a very large facility for the Chinese, I assume in China, to make nuclear weapons fuel. I'll start with you, Rick. What's your sense of, is that a key limiting factor, or have the Chinese figured out the way to build a lot more nuclear material so they can build more warheads?
Peter, I don't claim to be an expert on the nuclear cycle in China, the extent of it. I certainly appreciate the research of others based on what we can see. My point would be to say there's also what we can't see, what the Chinese have been putting underground potentially for decades in terms of nuclear processing, nuclear fuel production. I would not trust even generous estimates based on available open sources. What the Chinese may have put underground may make up the balance in terms of providing the nuclear fissile materials for all the warheads that they may be planning to manufacture.
Gordon?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. There is a limiting factor, though, and that is the Chinese economy. We know that the Chinese economy is not growing as fast as the military budget. So for last year, the announced increase in the military budget was 7.2%. They just announced that the economy grew 5.2% last year, but it probably grew, if it grew at all, around 2%. The year before that, 2022, they announced 7.1% increase in the military budget. The economy, they said, grew 3.0%. Again, another number which is subject to doubt. They've got a debt crisis, which they have no way to deal with. They have other property issues in the economy that will probably drag down the economy. So if there's a limiting factor, I wouldn't focus so much on their production of fissile material. I'd be looking at their economy.
Fair enough. This is for both Rick and Gordon. Targeting policy in the U.S. has been often controversial because those who are part of the global zero disarmament community say we should only target cities. And they say if you target the other guy's weapons, the temptation is to go first to disarm the guy before he disarms you. The argument then is, given the cities are pretty much where they are in China, they don't move. There's a certain number that if we take out would give us deterrence. What's your sense as to, do the Chinese value their population enough that that's all you need to hold at risk? Or as Franklin Miller, who was a member of the Posture Commission, said, we may not have to match warhead for warhead the Russian and Chinese arsenals, depending on how they grow, but we do need to have the capability to deter. And that requires being able to target more of their military capability, because that capability has gone up. What's your sense, Rick, on that? And then I'll turn it over to Gordon.
Well, I would simply question whether the Chinese Communist Party values the lives of its people to the same degree that the elected American government values the lives of its people. I mean, let's just consider, how many Chinese did Mao massacre during his reign? Estimates range from 60 to 75 million. And none of them have received any justice that I'm aware of. So on top of that, you have now almost 7 million people around the world, including in China, who have died from the Chinese coronavirus. Again, no justice, no even admission of culpability from the Chinese Communist Party for this travesty. So I don't think the Chinese will have any problem in targeting our cities and our nuclear capability. And I agree with Secretary Miller that we need the ability to deter, which means we require a far larger arsenal. We have to deter both China and Russia, and the arsenal that we have today, I don't think is going to do that job.
Gordon.
Well, Xi Jinping reveres Mao Zedong, and Mao Zedong was famous for saying, what's nuclear war? They killed 300 million Chinese, we got 300 million left. And I think that gives a real indication into the thinking of Xi Jinping. So you target what they value. I don't think they value people. I think they value themselves and they value the elements of their regime. So you've got to hit Beijing because that has so much that they care about. But I think with the limited number of deployed weapons we have, I think you go after their military capability. I agree with Rick. We need to have more warheads. The way to avoid this issue is you just destroy everything. And that's a horrible answer, but we have to create deterrence. And right now, for many reasons, we are not deterring China.
Understood. We have just a few minutes left, and I'm going to turn it over to our president and founder, Jim Petrosky, for any final thoughts or questions, and then I'll finish by asking Gordon and Rick to give us a paragraph or so to summarize what they have told us today. Jim, over to you, sir.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, first of all, thank you, all the people that joined us. I hope you found this extremely valuable. Certainly thank Gordon Chang and Richard Fisher for their important comments and information they provided here. There's a lot to take away and unpack here. So you guys just are a wealth of information. So thank you. Richard, I did send you a chat message just regarding the availability of your slides for our listeners so we can let them know what's happening. So we can post those. Good. Yes. We will post Richard's slides on our webpage and make them available along with the recording of this. And so I'm going to turn, as Peter said, turn it to Gordon and Richard for their last comments. But come back 2 weeks from now. We have more to give you on this series from Peter. And we're really excited to do this. Thank you so much. You're making us shine. Go ahead. I'll just start with Gordon.
Gordon, let me interrupt on 1 minute. We have 4 threat briefings in January and February. Alex will send out the invitations for and I think he's already done that. Our next one is going to be on Korea. One of our speakers is going to be speaking from Korea. So it's going to be a little bit later in the day. Then we will have a briefing on Iran with Shoshana Bryan and Elon Berman. And a gentleman from the Heritage Foundation will be joining us on Korea. And then finally, we will have Mark Schneider and Steve Blank, who will talk to us about Russian strategic nuclear threats, but also what can we learn from Ukraine and the war there and the threatened use of nuclear weapons by Mr. Putin. How has that perhaps changed Russian nuclear doctrine, or what is it illustrated about it? So Gordon, over to you for a final word, and then we'll go to Rick.
Thanks, Peter and Jim. At the moment, there are wars in Europe, Ukraine. There are insurgencies fueled by China and Russia in North Africa, and they look like wars. And of course, the war in the Middle East. A couple days ago, we saw Iran attack Pakistan with missiles. And one can say, oh, what's the big deal about this? The big deal is now the bad actors think they can do what they want. And we have seen an emboldened Iranian regime fire missiles, not only at Pakistan, but also Syria and Iraq. We have seen Iran's terrorist proxies paralyze the region. And this should remind us of the 1930s. In the late 1930s, there were wars across the world, but they eventually merged into what we now call the Second World War. Right now, we could have the same dynamic in play. The only difference, of course, is that now the bad actors have the world's most destructive weapons. And we're in a world that we are just not comprehending. We can talk about this, but we have to start thinking about what happens when a bold or a desperate China or Russia or North Korea decides to bring everything down. That, unfortunately, is the world that we are now in. Thank you.
Rick, final word.
Tim, Peter, thank you again for the invitation to join this inaugural event. And I look forward to the next sessions in Peter's series. I would simply conclude with 2 points. First, the Chinese Communist Party is seeking, in my opinion, nuclear superiority. They're not interested in parity. They've completely disavowed any interest in nuclear arms control for decades, despite repeated American approaches. And they have embarked on an open program of nuclear defensive cooperation with Russia that suggests the possibility, the high possibility of nuclear offensive cooperation as well, which even at the level of nuclear coercion is terrifying and potentially it could produce political and then military defeats for the United States that we have not yet really considered in the open. Secondly, I would like to emphasize that in terms of theater nuclear weapons, China could very well already have massive superiority. China telling our scholars when they visit that they have no tactical nuclear weapons would be consistent with Chinese disinformation practices. They would clearly want to have tactical nuclear superiority on the eve of any major conflict, especially over Taiwan or against Japan. And this just points me to the conclusion that the United States requires immediately a crash program to be able to deter China and Russia at the strategic level, as well as a far expanded theater tactical nuclear capability, perhaps approaching that of Cold War levels, to include tactical nuclear artillery in order to deter both Russia and China and North Korea now at the tactical nuclear level. And I'll stop there and thank you again, Peter.
And thank you. I want to thank you on behalf of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, on behalf of myself and Jim Petrosky, our president. And I want to thank Alex for his great help in putting this on. And particularly to our speakers, I also want to shout out to some of our sponsors who are here today, who joined us. Also say hello to Rich Colvin, who runs a equally wonderful series of programs on the Hill on the nuclear issues and strategic issues. And I want to just thank all of you for chiming in. We have our next seminar will be on Korea, and it's coming up, I believe, in 2 weeks. And then we have 2 more in February, and then we have a whole series of events in March and April and May, which we're going to hear from outside sources coming in on the president's budget request, the posture statement, and then we will go with our U.S. military, Air Force, and Navy speakers, and then we'll finish with some members of the United States House of Representatives and Senate with respect to the Armed Service Committees and the Appropriations Committees. And it's basically the formula we've followed for 40 some odd years. And if you have suggestions of speakers, topics, and you would like to help us out as a sponsor, please let Jim or I know, or Alex. And again, I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy days to join us. And again, we'll see you soon. And again, to Gordon and to Rick, thank you.